and thank you for joining our panel session today, in which we're discussing how to make risk transfer more accessible. My name is Victoria Sander, and I'm a corporate insurance partner at Latham and Watkins in London. I've focused on the insurance sector for over 20 years and have worked for trustees, insurers, and other participants in a wide range of longevity and bulk annuity transactions. It's been very interesting to be involved in a sector that has been innovative in terms of structures and commercial solutions. However, not wanting to be complacent, it's important to always ask whether there remain barriers for sponsors and trustees and to reflect on different approaches and models. With that in mind, I'm joined by a panel of market participants, all of whom have engaged in de-risking processes and who have a wealth of experience in the pensions industry. They're Peter Harris, Pensions Director of Telent, which recently engaged in a full buyout with Rothsay Life. Hugh Evans, a Trustee Executive of BESTrustees, who as a professional trustee can provide an overview of perspectives on de-risking strategies for a range of different schemes. And Antony Barker, Managing Director of the Pension Superfund, which is expecting regulatory approval in the coming weeks to be the UK's first full consolidator of legacy defined benefit pension obligations as a flexible and usually cheaper alternative to buying out with an insurer. So welcome to all of you. If we could kick off with our first question. So first I wanted to ask, is longevity risk well understood by corporate sponsors and trustees, do you think? And if not, can anything be done to improve the level of understanding? So Peter, if I could direct this question first to you, wearing your pension director hat.
Okay, thanks, Victoria. I mean, yeah, I've sat very much in on the border between the trustee and the corporate. And it's a classic two-part answer to this one. I think, do they understand longevity risk at a top level? Yes, absolutely, because it's one of the simplest parts of the overall valuation picture to understand. If people live longer, we're going to pay them more pensions. But then you get down into the detail of how we measure this stuff and the fact that we're talking to such a range of audiences, from specialist advisors to professional trustees to lay trustees. Then you get into the corporate and you get what I would call engaged senior management and non-engaged senior management. And it almost feels to me like the kind of thing we're seeing with the COVID crisis at the moment, when you get experts interacting with non-experts. And classically, the actuary turns up at the valuation really pleased with himself because he's got a new, more detailed longevity model that helps to model this more precisely. And the trustee and even more the sponsor go, we thought we understood this stuff. You know, you were talking about cohorts last time. Why are you talking about long-term trend models now? You don't seem to know what you're talking about. And it's that lack of understanding of experts developing their model with lay people who just dealing with a concept that it's very difficult for them to understand. And the goalposts seem to start changing, and I think there's a real disconnect between the communities there. And my favourite question to anybody is: we try to integrate longevity measures into other modelling, but can anybody really genuinely tell me what 1 year VAR 95 of longevity actually means in reality?
Well, that's a good question. If I could pass it on, please, to Hugh for your perspectives on that.
I think longevity risk has very few parallels in the corporate world because the consequences of an adverse experience take a long time to emerge. So that there are risks that are associated with changing your assumptions from one valuation to the next. And that's a little different from the risk of having to pay pensioners for longer than you're expecting. So in terms of getting senior execs to understand that, it's quite hard to find analogies that really help them decide when and what action to take.
Understood. Antony, is there anything from your perspective in terms of engagement with trustees and sponsors in the de-risking market that makes you have a particular view on that?
I mean, Pete made a good point about sort of trustees and the layperson understanding it and sort of referencing sort of COVID. And, you know, we see in the daily briefings where we can't even agree what the statistic for deaths is. You know, do we mean deaths in hospital? Do we mean deaths nationally? Deaths from COVID? Deaths where COVID was there somewhere? And this is the same problem here, because when the actuary comes in and says, I want to talk to you about longevity, do they mean longevity of the UK population? Longevity of the scheme members itself? Do they mean what's going to happen between now and the next valuation? Or, you know, what about over the next 20, 30, 40 years? And largely that will depend. You know, if you're going to sort of look to buy out or transfer the risk, you may have a very different perspective to somebody who was saying, right, well, I'm just going to run this on for 30, 40, 50, 60 years. So you know, there's clearly a challenge with definition. The second problem is not appreciating the second order effect. So very quickly we say, oh, well, you know, if people live longer, we'll pay pensions for longer. But that has actually impact on governments, and it has impacts on investments as well. So whilst we might have a better idea of the immediate impact on individuals for their life expectancy, it has different ramifications for things like healthcare. What does that mean in terms of the retirement age? What sort of work can people effectively do? You know, where should I be therefore investing? And, you know, what's a natural hedge? I think the one thing though we can agree though is that the problem has become more pertinent, and probably, although much has been said about falling interest rates and to an extent falling inflation over the last 2 decades, the reality is a lot of pension schemes, and we're talking final salary pension schemes, were set up 60s, 70s and 80s when, you know, the average expectation of life for a male was about 69 years. So in fact, if you retired from a pension scheme, you might only expect to get paid for 4 to 5 years. That's why we put guarantees into payouts, because there was quite a high likelihood that you wouldn't actually last 5 years. Whereas if you're a 65-year-old today, you're expected to live for 19 years. So the actual payout of pension, it's not just the fact that people are living longer, but the period now where the pension is being paid has gone up maybe 4 times. I mean, that's an enormous financial drain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. And it seems to me that the real juggle here is how trustees and sponsors weigh up longevity as against various other risks that are facing the schemes. So how do you think trustees and sponsors do approach that weighing up exercise at the moment? Hugh, is that one that you have a particular view on for different types of scheme?
Yeah, what I see now fairly routinely is looking at longevity risk in the context of investment risk. So I agree with Peter that when you see a bar for longevity alongside a bar for interest rate risk or what have you, then that does raise some question marks as to how those numbers are calculated for longevity. But even so, it's been a good hook to get general buy-in that if you've started dialing down the risk in all the other factors where you are taking risk, then all of a sudden you find the longevity bar is disproportionate. And it's a relatively easy conversation to have then to explore the feasibility of taking longevity risk off the table. So that's the usual route of that conversation. You start with the general concept of de-risking, dial down some of the major investment risks, And then it starts to look as if longevity is your biggest issue.
Yes, understood. Peter, you've recently gone through a significant de-risking process at Telent. So what are your thoughts on how trustees and sponsors might weigh up longevity alongside other risks? And were there any lessons learned from your experience, do you think?
Oh, that's an area where I think I'll start again from the top level, where actually the regulator model of funding risk, which basically I look on as liability risk, which is where your longevity risk lives, investment risk and sponsor risk, and actually balancing those three is the big question. And as Hugh was describing, we've been down a similar route, whereby our advisors integrated longevity risk into our investment risk model. The extent to which I believe that was a successful, and I've yet seen a successful version of doing that, is another question. But what is it now? 2 years ago, this time 2 years ago, before we actually realized how close we were to the market for full buyout, our investment committee said, right, we're generating more returns than we need to hit our target. How are we going to spend that excess return? Are we going to dial down the investment risk, i.e. get there in the target timetable? Are we going to dial down the sponsor risk, which actually meant keeping with the same investment risk but getting there quickly, so we're exposed to the sponsor for less time? Or are we going to go and hedge liabilities? And the thing that we found was we didn't have a tool whereby we could, to any meaningful degree, quantitatively compare those three risks. We'd done longevity and investment in an imperfect way, but we really couldn't build in sponsor risk. I mean, we were lucky in that before we had to take that decision, we actually realized that the market had come towards us, and yeah, bingo, we just used the least subtle tool in the toolbox. Get the sledgehammer out. Yep, we can buy out the whole thing. Whack. And that's what we did. So we didn't actually have to make that decision, but it was one we were really struggling with at the time.
So just going back to Hugh then to have a reflect on that. So obviously that's a scheme at a particular stage of its journey, and with arguably a nice problem to have. There obviously are schemes not in that position. So do you find that sort of weighing up between longevity and longer term sponsor risk, is that a frequent thing, and how do you think schemes are approaching that in the current circumstances?
I think trying to quantify the sponsor risk is a step on from what most schemes are doing. And if you look back actually at the work that EIOPA did in looking for a way to implement Solvency II in pensions, they invested a lot of money in trying to measure sponsor risk and really didn't make very much progress. What they were finding is that whatever model they created for capturing that, a small change to that model gave you a wildly different outcome. And so they more or less gave up on that. So when schemes are looking at sponsor risk, it tends to be in a more deterministic way than the other risks are mentioned. And you're basically looking at affordability. In terms of understanding the time element, you're sort of looking at the duration of the contracts they have, understanding what the threats to their business, and from a trustee point of view, you're looking at as a businessman sort of faced with business risks, and then trying to integrate it into the rest of what you're doing, which is much more mathematical modelling, and the two don't come together easily. So you end up making a rather subjective decision about that.
Mm. Do you think that the pensions regulators' position pressing for longer term funding targets and journey plans, is that affecting the way that trustees and sponsors are approaching this topic?
I think in practice it's doing little more than spreading what was best practice in sort of the best run schemes into the wider market. So I think a lot of schemes, it won't change what they're doing because they've already been doing that sort of long-term thinking, but it might provoke schemes that hadn't considered what the end game actually looked like, and therefore hadn't even started the conversation about de-risking and how they were even going to get there, what sort of period they were going to take to get there. I think it's moved that conversation on and forced some employers to articulate how they're going to finance these benefit promises in a way that goes beyond simply arguing about what contributions can be afforded from one year to the next.
And thanks for that. Antony, if I could bring you in at this point. So obviously, from a provider's perspective, you'll be engaging with schemes as well. So do you have a perception from the provider's side of things as to how longevity and other risks are being seen and prioritised by schemes?
Absolutely. So, I mean, just to make clear, I mean, our model is a run-off model. So we take on the assets and liabilities of an existing scheme and hold it for 40, 50, 60 years. And although I can clearly hedge rates, inflation and things, longevity is quite clearly going to be one of my biggest risks going forward. I mean, Peter made the point that, you know, they were in the right place at the right time and are very much Napoleonic lucky general in terms of being able to do the transaction. But the reality is that only sort of somewhere between 1% and 3% of UK pension funds are able to buy out every year. And that's not necessarily just a question of affordability. There is a finite capacity of the insurance industry to do transactions over and above their capital. And so very much trustees are sort of left, you know, in a situation where they are dependent on the sponsor covenant. And, you know, the reality is most pension schemes are probably only 70, 80, 90% funded and probably nowhere near that on an insurance company basis. So there is an enormous deficit versus the exit proposition. And the challenge in the other direction is, you know, how long can you persist with it and manage the affordability for the sponsor? You know, as I said, you know, a lot of these pension schemes set up 60s, 70s and 80s and traditionally are attached to old industry. So big manufacturing companies, big industrial, big retailers, and you don't need to be a pensions expert to know how many of those have failed in the last 5, 6, 7 years. And, you know, I mean, we've obviously had the Pension Protection Fund operating now for about 17 years, and there's about 50 to 100 schemes go into assessment every year. So we know the high profile names, but the reality is there's lots going. So almost as many get to buyout as actually fail and end up in the PPF. So, you know, there needs to be a way for trustees to try and either manage the solution with the sponsor in terms of achieving affordability, or, you know, this was the essence for creating the Superfund. That's why the pensions ministers asked us to set it up, was saying, well, any industry that is ultimately in runoff, and unfortunately the final salary scheme for most private sectors is, then it only is economically viable through some form of consolidation model. And, you know, we've witnessed similar in Australia and the Netherlands. So the ground is well trodden. So when we're, you know, but the essence for a transaction, the driver for a transaction, is probably going to come from the sponsor, though, not actually the trustees, because normally there is a big check that has to be written. Cheaper if you're going to a consolidator, but there is a check that needs to be written. And the company's got to sort of do this juggling act, not just between the cash cost, but it's currently the time that the senior management is spending on the pension scheme, and whether there is any HR benefit from still retaining this legacy. I mean, many of these schemes were closed, you know, 15 years ago or more. So the current workforce aren't getting the benefit of it, and yet it's draining a lot of cash, it's draining a lot of time. And so, and then the other thing for the company is, you know, what's the accounting, you know, consequences of doing that? You know, you've got many companies that actually are only supposedly with a strong balance sheet because they're taking credit for an enormous pension surplus that isn't really there. It's just a function of the accounting nuance. You strip out that, it's a very weak sponsor sponsoring a very, very big problem. So increasingly we're seeing companies coming to us and saying, right, we need an exit, and the new pensions bill and potential criminal powers that's bringing in and charges that could be levied against directors and non-exec directors, that's giving a lot of people a wake-up call. But then there's equally a number of trustees who are being brutally realistic, and we're certainly with this evolution of the independent trustee, people like you who can sort of see this from both sides of the fence, they can step away from the, should we say, the behavioural bias. One of the challenges when you have sort of all employee trustee groups is, rightly, they assume the company is going to pay their salary at the end of the month. They might get a bonus next year. So they believe their sponsor will carry on in perpetuity. But the truth is companies don't. Even big companies don't. Something like about a third of FTSE 100 companies have failed or run into serious financial difficulties since 1985. So, any scheme sponsor could run into trouble. So if a set of trustees like Pete's did have the opportunity to exit, then rightly they're going to grab it. And, does longevity enter into that decision? Well, it does. But as Hugh's alluded to, there's lots of things you can do in terms of de-risking the strategy, having a journey plan, and that's certainly what the regulator is doing, and working out when's the optimum point to jump. And the way we operate is that because we novate the existing assets and the existing administrator, then we can be a little bit easier in terms of taking on schemes. And it's not just a question of price, it's getting the transaction cost side down as well, and therefore making the switch as expedient as possible, as well as affordable as possible.
Thank you. That's very interesting perspective. So we've talked a bit about understanding and prioritising longevity risk alongside other risks. I feel that given our current circumstances with COVID-19, and without us sort of spending a lot of time on the actuarial ins and outs of it, but I just wanted to ask the question as to whether you think that what's happening at the moment will have had an impact on sponsors and trustees' priority in terms of de-risking. So both in terms of what might be the right strategy, but also the timing of that. Anthony, perhaps I could put this back to you first of all, as to whether you think that there could or should be a change in attitudes.
Well, I mean, there was a sort of a moment in mid-March when insurance company pricing was theoretically very, very cheap, the sort of quirk of how their pricing models are made up. And for those schemes that had a sort of a transaction in train, all the data was cleaned up, the contracts were drafted and everything, you could have sort of gone go, go, go and hopefully secured a very, very good price. My experience is that sort of 2-3 weeks on now, that sort of a more normal pricing market has evolved. And, those schemes that were possibly thinking they were in the right place now might find that either the pricing's moved away from them again, or probably more pertinent, if they were looking for an additional sponsor contribution to fund any shortfall, then clearly corporate cash flow is somewhat constrained at the moment, and will no doubt be for the foreseeable future. So, the thing is about any sort of risk transfer, it's not a quick transaction. I mean, you're looking at a period of somewhere probably between 6 months to a year, as you go through all the various stakeholder discussions that you want to do it, getting an understanding of what the price is, having a look at the quality of your data. I mean, again, if you're a long-term scheme, you've probably got some little legacies which didn't really matter if you were just running on the scheme, because you'd say, well, that's fine, I'll sort out Mrs. Jones's pension when she finally comes to retire in 8 or 9 years' time. I don't need to know today exactly whether she's got a spouse, how old that spouse is, whether she's moved to Glasgow from South Wales, and all the other details that you need to do a detailed insurance buyout transaction. So lots of discussions, lots of strategizing, lots of data cleanup to optimize the pricing. And then there's sort of, well, do we need to do things with, you know, managing the assets into the right sort of shape as well. But probably what people haven't done, and coming back to maybe the subject of this, is perhaps looked at other ways of managing longevity. And, you know, whilst we can sort of go onto the BBC website and see how markets have gone up and down, and now all have a view on whether the price of sort of Brent or Western oil futures is the correct one, you know, conversations we never thought we'd be having. Longevity is very, very difficult. It's very, very lagged. And, you know, so trying to come up with understanding what the trends are, you know, what's happening for your particular scheme. Have you got enough members that you're statistically different to the rest of the country? And, you know, are you big enough that somebody is wanting to do a transaction with you purely on the longevity side, particularly as it's very difficult for people to have a natural hedge on the other side. I mean, post-financial crisis, you know, the capital requirements on financial institutions have become increasingly stringent, and the only way you can effectively manage those down is if you have some sort of back-to-back transaction. And whereas interest rates, inflation, it's fairly easy to identify natural hedges on the other side. Longevity is a much more difficult one. So it's often perceived as something of a naked risk. You know, if you're taking it on, you know, it could be a one-way bet. You just really don't know. And you're looking at other ways to either price it or manage a portfolio of other investments that you hope in some way will have a correlated performance to inflation trends. But, you know, the actuarial mortality surveys, you know, only come out roughly about once a year. You know, they're a good time after the year end. The other challenge we have is understanding who's dying. I mean, you might think that's a rather silly question, but, you know, we only do a population census every 10 years. And so what you're trying to tie up is the people who are alive in the UK with the people who are dying in the UK, because they're not necessarily, again, at the same time periods. You know, we get immigration, people die on holiday this way and that way, you know. So trying to get definitive data and say, well, you know, the trend is this, is very, very difficult, and very difficult to do on fairly short-term periods. So trying to come up with sort of tradable or very, very standardized, very, very transparent measures for de-risking longevity on its own has been challenging for the industry for years, and therefore tends to be the preserve of either the very, very large schemes or the institutions who can aggregate a lot of lives and say, you know, this is what's working for us, you know. And our model will be that we're going to merge the liabilities. It's a single scheme, and, you know, it gets easier for us because as we start going to 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 lives, we're going to look like UK population statistics, and, you know, very easily we'll be able to say, well, you know, we look like the rest of the country, and that makes it a lot easier to manage. You can have much greater certainty on your future cash flows. If you're a small scheme of only 20, 30, 40, 50 million pounds, you probably haven't got that degree of granularity, and you can't really make many sensible assumptions. You can't assume that Mrs. Jones is 0.00018% dead next year. She's either dead or alive, and probably because she's alive, you're going to have to pay her pension.
that feels like a good time to bring Hugh in. So you will undoubtedly have some experience of how different schemes are dealing with COVID-19 and how it's affecting priorities within the schemes that you're involved in, but also clearly we've had some views there from Antony on what he perceives to be the implications for longevity hedging. Could I ask you to share with us any thoughts you have on that?
You can imagine that for most trustees, the work they've been doing arising from COVID-19 over the last month and a half have mostly been around operational issues, just making sure that the administration still works, that you're still collecting contributions, paying the right people. There won't be very many trustee boards who turn their attention to longevity risk to see whether there are new opportunities. So to Antony's point, there are transactions that are underway, but most of the legwork would have been done before March. The transactions that are much earlier in their project plans, those are the ones where folk have just paused them, maybe just because they can't give them the airtime, but also because quite possibly we will see the nature of transactions change a little bit. What we saw back in sort of 2008, 2009, when companies started to worry about letting liquid assets like cash leave their control, you started to see pension schemes transact longevity swaps to take away the longevity risk rather than going the whole hog and doing a buy-in or a buyout. So it'll be interesting to see towards the end of this year whether we suddenly see rather more of those sort of transactions rather than buy-in, buyout. That'll be interesting. And I think, if anything, it's more likely than it was 10 years ago, because 10 years ago, longevity swap was really new thing. And you didn't know whether you could actually convert it into an annuity. You could set it up, in the expectation, but you couldn't point to any precedent showing that worked. Whereas over the following 10 years, we have seen longevity swaps become buy-ins and buyouts. So I'm sort of expecting more longevity swap activity. That said, if you're a trustee, then there's quite a lot of regret risk associated with committing to an annuity or even a longevity swap. And what I mean by that is that if you start the ball rolling now and you transact, 6 months' time or maybe 12 months' time, and you then find over the following 12 months that rather significant excess mortality in your scheme, then you'll find in effect that you've overpaid for that annuity. And the context here is, if you look at London, for example, the excess mortality is currently running at 100% more or less. So it's potentially a big factor. So a lot hangs on whether there's going to be a therapy or even a vaccine put out for COVID-19 in the near future. Hopefully there will be, in which case the overall impact on that component of pricing won't be that profound. But it's not guaranteed. There's a lot of water to flow under that bridge.
Thank you. So Peter, can I ask possibly a cheeky question, which is your transaction was signed before COVID took place. Are you really very glad that you completed the project before COVID? And do you think that would have altered any of your decisions or timing had you known it was coming?
I mean, it's a very simple answer. If you can get to that point, COVID or no COVID, it's great. And I have had members coming along and say, I've had a number of questions from our members saying, should you have done this? Are we in a worse position now? You'd been managing our investments really well. Now you've given it up. And I just say back, it looks like a better decision than ever. Simply because of just taking that risk off the table. And yeah, that links back to almost where I started, the fact that, picking up on what Antony said about, we've been trying to understand this for years. And what's COVID done for us? Oh, brilliant. It's added another variable into the mix. So that looks like more volatility. That looks like something that a risk I want to take out. But then I turn to my sponsor and say, oh, they don't look quite as solid as they did 2 or 3 months ago. So I need to concentrate on that risk. And actually, who knows where I'm going to get investment? So it doesn't feel like a rebalanced risk environment. It just feels like every risk has gone up. So to come back to the first question, it feels quite comfortable to be where we are.
And I think it's worth saying, I mean, there's multiple sources of regret risk, you know, in all aspects of managing a pension scheme. And we're trying to sort of mitigate that within our model in that, you know, if it turns out we have excess mortality, that ultimately will increase the relative levels of assets to liabilities, and we share a third of that excess with the members of the scheme. So, you know, there is some upside for them in that participation, whereas the reality is, coming back to what Peter just said, you know, their members were in a good position, but most members are in a scheme that is underfunded and is unlikely to have a sponsor that is going to last for 30, 40 years. And if their sponsor fails, if they're an underfunded scheme, great that there's now the pension protection fund, but chances are they'll get a reduced benefit. So, you know, from a member, yeah, they're either wanting total buyout security and saying, well, great, you know, you've got me to that position, I've got my benefits paid in full and secured in full, or, you know, they need some sort of mechanism that says, if I am going to take on some sort of residual risk, then I need to be rewarded for that risk. And historically, that's not the case with company pension schemes. If they run into surplus, then the sponsor takes a contribution holiday. So, you know, there's never really been an upside for members. The best they could ever hope for historically was getting 100% of their benefit entitlements. And for many members, that is most definitely what they've not got. So what we've tried to do is sort of redress that in some sort of recreation of a with profits model. An unfortunate turn in sort of equitable life sort of nomenclature, but I think the principle was well understood for members as take all the other problems away from me and just give me some sort of upside.
So just bringing us back to topics around the risk hedging strategies that exist from a practical and commercial perspective. So as those who sort of participate in that market in one form or another, what do you think of the options available for schemes and sponsors? And are there any particular barriers with what's currently available? I suppose that's one to initially ask Peter, because the process that you went through recently, do you have any observations about that, or issues that with hindsight were not as you were expecting, or more painful, difficult?
I mean, it really comes back to almost where I started, this whole issue of governance, of how on earth does the trustee make these decisions in a rational manner. And I keep coming back to this point that we were quite lucky, because certainly some of the earlier questions, it almost felt like Hugh and Antony were actually talking about us. You know, and Hugh was talking about you know, the advantage of looking longer term and looking for buyout as a long term aim, and when Antony was talking about the large industrial companies shrinking, if you follow telent back at Companies House, before telent it was called Marconi, and before that GEC with its famous cash mountain, we were as stable as you could possibly be, and we ended up where we were. And so when it came to looking at this market, there seemed to be a lot of perception about, oh yes, phased buy-ins are the way to go. And you know, you learn more about the process and you prove to the market that you're serious by going down the phased buy-in route. Now, again, we were in a very lucky position. We said, you know what? Actually, as one of our investment committees said, we're getting close to being able to buy out. It's a bit like putting a cheeky offer in on a house. You never know, you might just get lucky. And that was what we found. Because actually where we got to before then, when we were looking at doing some buy-ins to start reducing risk, we couldn't find longevity swaps that were attractive within our overall investment model. But we were looking at buy-ins, and the conclusion we came to with the knock-on with the reduction in investment return elsewhere of doing that, or the need to take more investment risk on a smaller group of assets, was almost the risk we'd be hedging by going down the partial buy-in route. And I think it was Hugh referred to this earlier. What are we actually looking at here? Are we looking at people living longer, or are we looking at actuarial modelling of how long people are going to live? And we almost came to the conclusion that if we're going to go down that route, we weren't actually hedging longevity, we'd actually be hedging pricing risk.
Hugh, obviously you'll have looked at de-risking for schemes at different stages in their journey. Do you have particular perspectives on the options available? And also probably worth picking up on the point about phased buy-ins and how they would fit in alongside other strategies.
The options, there's quite a bit of debate right now about the relative merits of doing a phased buy-in with a provider, or doing a self-managed buy-in where you basically try and shadow the way an insurance company would actually run that portfolio. Historically, that sort of self-managed has been the approach of the bigger funds, and that smaller funds have really found it necessary to go to an insurance product. That's where I think the industry is waiting with great interest to see what happens with the consolidators. I touched on earlier how some funds have used longevity swaps as a stepping stone to buying an annuity. So what I'm seeing is an increasing variety of ways that you can get the sort of security that trustees are trying to get for member benefits. One would hope that the innovation will continue. That doesn't make the job of trustees any easier. But to be honest, the role of the trustee during transaction is really very high level one. And so it can be quite a shock to the system to find yourself spending, one of the largest amounts that you're involved in spending in your entire life. And actually, you've not had that many meetings about it. It's a very steep learning curve if you've not been through it before. One of the advantages of the phase buy-in is that I hesitate to say it, a dip a toe in the water, because the numbers involved are still big, but you don't put all your eggs in one basket with all the potential for getting that wrong. I think, as I say, what we will see is an increasing number of schemes going down this route. One way or another, they will find taking risk off the table, and it's partly with this push that the regulator's given. But of course, what's happening in the markets right now and what's happening to UK companies may put the brakes on. We just don't know to what extent the economy is going to be reined back by what's going on just now.
Thank you. And Antony, if I could direct this to you now, because pension consolidation is obviously a different option. So how does that fit alongside other sort of more traditional tools, which we've talked about as sort of self-managed buy-ins, buyouts, and pure longevity?
Okay, well, it's worth saying there's probably sort of four ways of looking at risks. The first and probably the worst is just to ignore it or not even appreciate that it actually exists. And many people are guilty of many things, and particularly longevity could well be one of them. The second level is to sort of accept it, or if you want to give it a technical term, you could call it self-insurance, and say, well, we are, it's there. There's nothing I can do about it. The slightly more sort of constructive solutions is either to manage it or transfer it. And there are, as been alluded to, varying sort of degrees of sort of structure attaching to that. I mean, crucially, as I said, almost coming back to where we started this conversation, how important is longevity risk management to you? Is it more important than simply sort of managing your investment portfolio, protecting capital there? Are there other things that you could have done in terms of managing interest rates or inflation risk first, and what impacts they have made? And in that regard, it's worth recalling that actually interest rate risk, and probably the one we spend most time discussing, in many respects is arguably the least important. Changes in interest rates simply change the value of the future cash flows that you've promised. They don't make them bigger. So inflation makes them bigger, longevity makes them paid for longer. Investing in something that is different, as in equities, will affect the affordability of the transaction. But interest rates simply just changes the net present value. And, we probably spend too much time, or disproportionate amount of time, talking about that one instead. So when you're coming to sort of a decision between sort of, should I manage it or should I transfer it, and looking at the varying different options, be it phased or some sort of self-managed, it's a competency question. Am I skilled? Is my team skilled? Have I got the right governance in place to be able to do this? And how long am I going to prepare to do this for? And then the second part of it is, well, what's the cost? And it's a little bit like a lot of these things. If you can put it off for a while and you're not a forced buyer, then you can probably get a better price. However, the longer you protract it, the more risk there is of something, a shock happening to the system. So either your asset markets collapse, or actually there's a step change in something. And longevity is an unusual thing, because it's probably the one risk that's biggest exposed to what might better be described as uncertainty rather than risk. It's very unlikely that we would have a sudden leap to sort of Zimbabwean style inflation levels overnight. But, and given the rest of the longevity conference agenda, there's clearly a lot of people working on the proverbial cures for cancers, DNA replacements, the therapies, stem cell tissue treatments, and I think, when you get to sort of doing stem cell tissue treatments for brain cells, you very quickly realize that from everything down here is mechanical and can be replaced, as I think my mother is aspiring to do anyway. But once you can sort of extend the life of the bit up here, then, we've potentially discovered immortality. And that throws up all sorts of interesting moral questions. And so people are, this is the, there comes a point where you just say, this is running this pension scheme, however much I have a sort of an altruistic, relationship with my former employers, it's not core to my business. Telent, Marconi, GEC, whatever it was, it never opened up the pension scheme thinking it had a life of being a major asset manager or a major quasi-insurance company. That is not the core business of the sponsor. And as Peter's alluded to, the scale and the nature of the company has changed. The pension scheme has just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and the problem has got more and more expensive to do. So they got to the point where, everything aligned, they were able to jump. And everyone else has just got to work out what the route is there. Hugh did mention, there are sort of phased routes, and, that is quite good. It sort of partially solves it. It puts a discipline on the journey plan. It is not a perfect solution. As I said, you still are the risk that you might have done the first 20 or 30% very efficiently, and then you still get suffered with a shock, and you got thrown off course. There is also occasionally the feeling that if you're sort of embedded with one company, they may give you a very, very good rate for the first tranche, and possibly you do the easiest bit to transact. and then subsequent tranches actually are disproportionately more difficult to do, because either the residual benefit is quite lumpy, or everybody else says, well, XYZ has already got 80% of the data, they can see the actual experience of the members. It's quite difficult for us to guess what it's going to be. And so it's a slightly unfair competitive landscape, and they choose not to compete for it. So, again, it's an exit solution. As I said, what we've come up and said, look, we're not dealing with the 1 or 2% here. We're not dealing with the failing ones here, although, unfortunately, we are dealing with quite a lot of so-called PPF plus cases at the moment. But it's trying to find a route where people are largely doing 95% of what they were, and we're just going to carry it on and say, look, it actually running this pension scheme is our core business. It's not yours. We're going to get your members to fully funded. We're going to offer the sponsor an exit price, which is considerably lower than possibly going to an insurance company, and you can go and focus back on your core business. Unfortunately, it may mean that, the pensions department reduces headcount, but, those benefits still need to be administered. So, a lot of the people will carry on being employed by us, and as I said, we take on board the existing administrators as well. So, and we think that, it's a good solution for us, but it's not the only solution. I think it's the best one, but it's not the only solution. And, we will see other models come into the market, and no doubt other ways of trying to manage it out. 5,500 pension schemes still in the UK. There's plenty of problems for lots of people to solve for many years to come. Yeah.
Oh, can I turn back to Hugh? That's been a very helpful insight into how you see it and the model for pension superfund. But I mean, Hugh, wearing your independent trustee hat, how do you see pension consolidation alongside other options as the sort of new kid on the block?
Well, I touched earlier on sort of the continuing innovation. So professional trustees would welcome new options to secure members' benefits, which is what we're there to do. And the consolidation, it looks very promising, but we're sort of waiting to see what the regulations actually end up saying. The big question for trustees is how high is government going to set the bar in terms of accepting a consolidation option rather than going down the traditional routes of insurance.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think we've all been waiting for some time with bated breath to understand the entire regulatory landscape for this, and we are still waiting. There's just one last question, I think, before we wrap up the session. So again, it would just be good to ask each of you in terms of the existing de-risking strategies. Are there any particular improvements or gaps that you perceive in the options available? So a couple of thoughts here. From the perspective of smaller schemes, I have heard it said that as the de-risking, particularly the insurance sector, is growing, a number of insurers are sort of focused more and more on the larger end of the market, and it's perhaps sometimes more difficult for smaller schemes to either be able to access or to get good pricing for options for them. And another thought I had was around longevity only deals, which historically I think have struggled for anything but the larger end of the scheme spectrum because of their sort of complexity. I think much of that probably results from collateral requirements and the fact that there are ongoing management complexity around it, which again probably only makes sense with that model for larger schemes. I'd be interested in your thoughts about those options and about the issues, and whether you think that there might be any gaps or other options that the market should be looking at. So, Hugh, there's obviously quite a lot in that question and this particular topic, but do you have any thoughts?
Well, what we've seen in recent years is when there is innovation, it tends to turn up as a sort of bespoke solution that big schemes have access to. And it gradually sort of gets commoditized and becomes available to smaller funds. So I'm hoping that we'll see more of that, so that, you know, life will get easier for the smaller funds. The point you made about the ongoing sort of requirements of longevity only deals really resonates. I think until small schemes are able to transact longevity only without effectively doing the best part of a full actuarial valuation every year, then they're just not going to be a mass market instrument. So I think, you know, right now, you wouldn't consider doing longevity only if your fund was less than about £250 million. If a way could be found through that, then that would be very attractive. I think that would make quite a big difference.
Peter, did you have any perspectives on that from the journey that you went through? Were there, I mean, it sounds as if the moving to buyout seemed a very natural option for you, but did you at any time feel that the options available just had to be ruled out because of issues with them? I think you're on mute,
Yeah.
Peter.
Sorry, I had a bit of background noise, so I went on to mute. Yeah, I think from our perspective, it was a case of it might have been quite useful actually as a big scheme to have a more commoditized product out there. Yeah, I remember sitting around one night and said, wouldn't it be fabulous if we had a longevity index? So not necessarily hedging against our actual liabilities, but yeah, we recognized it wouldn't be a perfect hedge, but it could take a significant amount of that risk away. And you know, I continually come back to our skepticism about the not the value, but the accuracy of the accuracy of longevity modeling. If you're looking at almost an inaccurately precise model, maybe a cruder tool for taking that out becomes attractive. And yeah, just picking up on one of the other themes that's been going on, this idea of having a journey plan, which is absolutely vital. And if you've got a journey plan, almost regret risk falls away. That's where we're looking to get to on our journey. We've got there. We could have got a bit cheaper, but we're on our track. Why do we really care? And so I think it's about, you know, having tools that are good enough rather than just looking for the perfect solution.
Yeah, interesting perspective. If I could just bring this back to Antony, do you have any perspectives on small scheme options in particular? And is there something around data quality and the complexity of what sort of other de-risking options are looking for around how good the data has to be?
Absolutely. I mean, there's some common themes here. I mean, firstly is data, as Hugh says, also cost, and you know, linked to that, I suppose familiarity. I completely endorse Pete's comment about some sort of index-based transaction. It's something I've looked at various times in my career, and you know, a lot you could get something that was sort of 85, 90% there with having a sort of standardized tradable index product. And if you can create a trading market, that drives down the cost. When people buy sort of, equity futures, they happily trade the FTSE 100, but they're probably not investing in just the FTSE 100. So, trustees are comfortable with a degree of so-called basis risk in what they're doing. But coming down to data and cost, I mean, crucial to this is technology, and an equally long-running saga on the government's front has been the pensions dashboard. Now, if we were genuinely to get a sort of a one-stop shop where everybody's pensions data was held in a single golden pool, then, I've often explained that the launch of the Superfund here, it's comparable with, the launch of the first smartphones. This is pension Superfund, this is PSF1, but PSF 10S will look pretty impressive, because I could see a sort of a finance director of a small company running a £5 million scheme, and he'll be able to go on to comparetheconsolidator.com, get immediate real-time pricing, and just say, right, I'm going for that one, click, and it's straight through data processing, the risk transfers immediately, and 2 weeks later he gets a cuddly toy of me in the post, which he can put on his shelf and say, that's it, or he gives it to one of his kids. That's a bit scary, isn't it? But technology will solve this, but ultimately it still comes down to getting the data sorted. And every time we go through a valuation cycle, every time somebody goes through a transaction, the data quality improves, but there are still some sort of long-term legacy messes that need to be tidied up, and we certainly don't have a common standard. And you can see this is the reason why the pensions regulator, in their sort of last few consultations, has really been pushing governance and the duty of trustees to either appoint an independent like you, or get other professionals involved and really upskill the whole process, enhance the data, and then come up with a something that they can do something with, and end up with a roughly right solution that either scales the problem down to the strength of the covenant that's supporting it, or just says, look, we don't want to do this any longer, we're out of here.
Well, I think you've given us plenty of food for thought. I think we need to leave it there, given where we are on time, but we've covered a lot of ground on this session. So thank you very much to all of you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.